A Roman senator rises in the Curia Hostilia. His name is Marcus Porcius Cato. His face looks chiseled from stone, weathered by decades under a Mediterranean sun. He has not come to argue, he has come to perform. From inside his toga, he draws a single fig, dark purple, heavy, skin still damp with dew. He says nothing. He simply passes it down the rows of senators, letting each man cradle it, sniff it, feel the soft give of fresh fruit harvested that very week. When the fig returns to him, Cato lets the silence stretch. Then his voice falls like a stone into a well. The land that grew this fig lies 3 days' sail from Rome. It was not a warning, it was a spell. And to feel the weight of it, you have to step back half a century, to a wheat field in southern Italy where the Republic almost died. The year is 216 BC. The place is Cannae. Picture yourself as one of the surviving legionaries, wading through something that no longer resembles the earth. The ground beneath your sandals shifts and sinks. It is not soil. It is 80,000 Roman corpses, piled on top of each other, some stacked 3 bodies deep. The iron taste of blood coats your tongue. The sound never stops. A low, broken hymn of dying men calling for water, for their mothers, for a blade to finish what Hannibal began. Hannibal Barca did not simply defeat Rome that day. He carved her open and left her trembling in her own blood. The wound never healed. It sank into the marrow of every Roman child born for the next 4 generations. What you are about to hear is not a war story. Wars are fought over land, grain, gold, borders. This was different. This was a 50-year campaign of revenge aimed at a memory. The Third Punic War was an execution dressed as policy, the slow murder of a ghost that walked through Roman dreams at night. Carthage did not need to fall because she was dangerous. She needed to fall because she still existed, and her existence reminded Rome of the day she was forced to her knees. This was not diplomacy. It was exorcism, and it would be written in fire, in salt, and in ash. We read every comment on this channel. Tell us the city and country you're watching from right now. And if you believe these buried stories deserve to be spoken out loud, hit subscribe and stand with the project. You're watching Ancestral, the best dark history channel in the world. 50 years had passed since Cannae, and Carthage no longer resembled the empire that had birthed Hannibal. The peace treaty of 201 BC, signed under the eyes of Scipio Africanus on a plain not far from the city itself, had been less a settlement than a slow amputation. Under its terms, Carthage could not raise a single legion, launch a single warship, or sign a single foreign alliance without Rome's signature on the parchment. Polybius, who walked the ruins a generation later and spoke with men who remembered the signing, recorded the additional clauses with cold precision. 500 warships burned in the harbor mouth, while Carthaginian citizens watched from the walls. The smoke, he wrote, was visible from the mountains of Numidia. Her overseas holdings, the constellation of colonies and trading stations that had once run from the Pillars of Hercules to the Sicilian coast, had been stripped from her in a single afternoon, of ink and wax. Gades, Carthago Nova, the silver mines of the Sierra Morena, the tuna fisheries off the African coast. All gone. What remained was a narrow ribbon of North African territory, roughly the size of modern Tunisia's northeastern tip, watched from across the Mediterranean by senators who never forgot what her ships had once done to Italian soil. She was no longer a power. She was a confession. A state on probation, sentenced to live quietly for the original sin of having been magnificent. Her statesmen spent their days arguing about harbor taxes and the price of barley. Her generals were old men with rusting helmets stored in temple alcoves. Her temples still smoked with offerings to Baal Hammon and the goddess Tanit, but the prayers were small now, the prayers of people who had stopped asking for victory and started asking for rain. And yet inside that small ribbon of coast, something began to grow that Rome had not predicted. Stripped of armies, the Carthaginians returned to the craft that had always been written into their bones: commerce. The circular harbor of Kothon, an engineering marvel that Appian would later describe in detail, contained two basins: the outer for merchant traffic, the inner a hidden military dock with covered slipways for 220 warships. With the navy gone, the inner harbor became another commercial space. Now it filled with merchant hulls from every corner of the known world. Spanish silver clinked across the wharves. Egyptian grain piled in towers along the quays. Greek amphorae of wine and oil came off the holds by the thousand. African ivory and ostrich plumes moved through the customs houses in a steady tide. In the inner workshops along the Byrsa hill, Carthaginian dyers boiled murex shells in lead vats until the air outside the dye houses stung the eyes and clung to the clothes of anyone who walked past. The purple they produced sold for more than its weight in gold. Their textiles dressed the courts of Pergamon and Alexandria. A single cloak dyed in Carthaginian Tyrian purple could fund a small estate. The people who had been forbidden to fight discovered they did not need to. They grew rich faster than anyone had thought possible. The treaty had bound them with a chain of silver, an indemnity of 10,000 talents, paid in 50 annual installments. The Romans had set the schedule with care. The payments were meant to choke any recovery in the cradle. In 191 BC, the Carthaginian Senate sent an embassy to Rome with a proposal. They wished to pay the entire remaining indemnity in a single lump sum, immediately. Livy preserved the exchange. The Roman Senate refused. They wanted the chain to remain. Picture the moment that refusal arrived back in Carthage. A clerk reading the response aloud in the Council of 104. The old aristocrats staring at one another in a silence that meant they finally understood. The debt had never been about money. It had been about the leash. Carthage paid anyway. She paid every installment on time. By the 170s BC, her ships were calling at ports as distant as the Black Sea. By the 160s, Roman grain merchants were complaining to the Senate that they could not match Carthaginian prices in Sicily itself. To senators who had been raised on stories told by uncles and grandfathers, men who had watched Hannibal's elephants come down out of the Alps, this was confirmation of a private terror. The beast had not died. It had simply stopped roaring, and now it was eating well. The fear that had once been a blade-edged thing of immediate survival began to settle into a slower poison. It became a hatred that no longer required reason. That hatred found its profit. Marcus Porcius Cato was not a man, exactly. He was a wound that walked. Born in 234 BC in Tusculum, a hill town 15 miles from Rome, he had served as a young military tribune under Marcellus during the war against Hannibal. He had fought at the recapture of Tarentum in 209 BC. He had marched with Scipio's forces into Africa. He had seen Roman dead stacked along Italian roads. He had watched towns he knew vanish into smoke at Cannae's aftermath, when the news rode north on exhausted horses. Plutarch, writing 2 centuries later, described Cato as a man who washed in cold water, drank the same wine as his slaves, and once sold an old workhorse because it could no longer earn its keep. He carried those years inside him the way other men carry old fractures. Every change in the weather a reminder. For Cato, the Second Punic War had never ended. It had only been paused. His obsession bled into everything. He turned the Senate floor into a confessional for a single sin. The transformation happened, according to Plutarch, in 153 BC. Cato, then in his 80s, was sent to Africa as part of a senatorial commission to mediate yet another border dispute. He had not seen Carthage with his own eyes since the war. What he found there did not look like a defeated city. It looked like a rival reborn. He walked the harbor and counted ships. He inspected the dye works and the grain stores. He returned to Rome carrying a single Libyan fig in the folds of his toga. He produced it in the Curia, fresh, still soft. He passed it among the senators. Then he told them how many days' sailing separated that orchard from their own forum. 3. After that day, he never closed a speech without the same 6 Latin words. Ceterum censeo Carthaginem esse delendum. Furthermore, I believe that Carthage must be destroyed. It did not matter what he had been discussing. Aqueduct repairs outside Tibur, a grain dispute in Ostia, a boundary quarrel between 2 estates in Etruria. The phrase became a kind of liturgy, a drumbeat under every Roman political conversation. A younger generation of senators who had never heard the sound of Hannibal's name shouted from the walls of their childhood grew up hearing those words instead. By the time they came to power, they no longer needed to be convinced. The destruction of Carthage had become, for them, simply how the world worked. Cato had one rival on the issue, Publius Cornelius Scipio Nasica Corculum, son-in-law of Scipio Africanus, argued against destruction. His reasoning was preserved by Diodorus Siculus and Plutarch. Nasica believed that fear of Carthage was the discipline that kept Rome honest. Remove that fear, he warned, and Rome would devour herself in civil wars within a generation. Every speech Cato closed with "Carthage must be destroyed." Nasica closed with "Carthage must be preserved." History would prove Nasica correct on the timeline. Within 100 years of Carthage's fall, Roman legions would be marching on Rome itself. But in the 150s BC, his voice lost the argument. Cato's mantra carried the room. What Rome needed now was a pretext, a piece of paper, a border crossed, a treaty violated, something that could be displayed in the forum as justification. They found their instrument in an old man on a throne in Africa. Massinissa, king of Numidia, was approaching 90. He had outlived 3 generations of his enemies. According to Polybius, who met him personally, the king still rode bareback at 88 and fathered a son at 86. He was Rome's loyal client, a man who owed his crown to Roman silver and Roman steel after Scipio had placed it on his head at Zama. He was the Republic's hunting hound in North Africa, and now they slipped his leash. The treaty Carthage had signed contained 2 clauses that, when held together, formed a perfect noose. The first forbade Carthage from making war without Roman permission. The second, almost an afterthought, guaranteed the borders of her remaining territory. Rome began to honor only one of those clauses. Massinissa, with quiet smiles from Roman envoys, began to nibble at Carthaginian land. The pattern was almost surgical in its repetition. A Numidian war band would cross the frontier and seize a stretch of farms near the Bagradas River Valley. Carthage, bound by treaty to seek arbitration rather than retaliation, would send a formal protest to Rome. A senatorial commission would sail south to investigate. The senators would walk the fields, hear testimony in the council chamber on the Byrsa, drink the wine of both sides, and return to Rome with a verdict that always tilted toward Numidia. A few years would pass. The next time, Massinissa would not take a stretch of farms. He would take an entire district, the Emporia region along the Lesser Syrtis. Then the inland fortress of Thuga. Appian records that by 162 BC, Massinissa had seized over 70 Carthaginian towns and villages. Each seizure was followed by another commission. Each commission produced another verdict for Numidia. This was not a series of border incidents. It was a vivisection conducted at the pace of seasons. Carthaginian territory was being shaved away inch by inch, with Rome holding the blade steady and Massinissa drawing it across the skin. The farmers driven from their land filled the streets of Carthage with their grief. They camped in the squares around the temple of Eshmun, on the Byrsa hill. The treasury watched its tax base shrink each year. The Carthaginians did everything the treaty asked of them. They did not raise a single soldier. They appealed to Roman justice. They were appealing to the men who had designed their disappearance. By 151 BC, the patience of an entire generation finally snapped. Inside Carthage, the political class fractured along generational lines. The old guard, men who remembered Zama and the burning fleet, argued for more letters and more delegations. They were led by Hanno the Great, by then an old man himself, whose family had argued for accommodation with Rome for 50 years. The other faction, younger men who had grown up watching their inheritances annexed by Numidian raiders, said something simpler, that a state which cannot defend its own farmland has already ceased to exist. Their leader was a populist named Hasdrubal, a grandnephew of Massinissa through his mother's line, who hated his Numidian relatives with the particular venom of family. The hardliners won the vote in the council. For the first time in half a century, Carthage raised an army. It was a hastily assembled force of around 25,000 men, drawn from city militia, mercenary recruiters in the Libyan interior, and farmers whose land had already been stolen. They marched out under Hasdrubal's command in the summer of 150 BC, to meet Massinissa's cavalry near a place called Oroscopa. The battle lasted weeks. Hasdrubal had the numbers. Massinissa had the experience and the mobility of Numidian horse. A young Roman officer named Scipio Aemilianus, grandson by adoption of Africanus, was present in Massinissa's camp on a diplomatic errand to collect war elephants. He watched the campaign from the Numidian lines and took notes. Those notes would matter later. The Carthaginian army was encircled, starved, then slaughtered as it tried to surrender. Of 25,000 men, fewer than a few thousand made it back to the city. But the battlefield outcome was the smallest part of what happened that summer. The instant Carthaginian soldiers raised spears without Roman permission, the trap that had been waiting for 50 years closed around them. In Rome, the news was presented not as the desperate act of a state defending its last fields, but as proof. Proof that Carthage had been lying all along. Proof that Hannibal's children were the same as Hannibal. Cato, now nearly 85 and almost deaf, rose in the Senate and was helped to his feet. The clerk who read his speech aloud did not need to add the final 6 words. The chamber recited them along with him. The vote for war was a performance, with the ending already memorized. The legions were drilling at Brundisium before the speeches were finished. Cato would not live to see the burning. He died in 149 BC, weeks after the declaration, his last political act accomplished. In Carthage, the realization of what had been done arrived with a cold clarity. The leaders who had voted for war, including Hasdrubal himself, were condemned to death by their own colleagues, their property confiscated, their bodies displayed as gestures of submission. Hasdrubal escaped into the countryside and began raising a private army of his own. The city would need him sooner than it knew. A diplomatic mission was assembled from the 30 oldest and most respected statesmen of the council. They were sent to Rome in the autumn of 149 BC to perform the most extreme act of surrender that Roman law recognized. They declared their people deditati in fidem populi Romani. This was not a treaty. This was not a negotiation. This was a total, unconditional surrender of every Carthaginian life, every Carthaginian coin, every Carthaginian field, and the city itself into the open hands of the Roman people. It gave Rome a blank scroll on which to write any sentence she chose. Under Roman religious law, the deditio also placed the gods of Carthage at Rome's mercy. The priests of Baal-Hamon and Tanit had, in a single legal phrase, surrendered their temples to a foreign pontifex. The Senate received the surrender with a graciousness that should have been a warning. They praised the wisdom of the Carthaginian elders. They assured the envoys that the Carthaginian people would keep their freedom, their laws, their territory, and their religion. The language was warm. The promises were generous. The ambassadors wept openly in the chamber. They believed they had saved their city by giving it away. Then the Senate mentioned, almost as a courtesy, that two consuls for the year 149 BC, Manius Manilius and Lucius Marcius Censorinus, had already sailed for Africa. With them traveled 80,000 infantry and 4,000 cavalry, organized into 4 legions and a large allied contingent. Among the junior officers serving as a military tribune in the 4th Legion was the same Scipio Aemilianus, who had watched the disaster at Oroscopa from Massinissa's camp. This force, the senators explained gently, was simply present to oversee the smooth implementation of the new arrangement. A formality, a precaution, nothing the Carthaginians needed to fear. The envoys boarded their ship for home with the Senate's words in one hand and the knowledge of that fleet in the other. The crossing took 8 days. By the time they reached the harbor of Carthage, the Roman sails were already a stain on the horizon to the north, gathering at the allied city of Utica. It is in moments like this, watching a civilization step willingly into a noose because the executioner is smiling, that you understand why this channel exists. The polished histories, written long after the fires cooled, prefer the clean language of treaties and incidents. They edit out the calculated cruelty. They smooth the deception until it looks like diplomacy. At Ancestral, we work the other way. We dig down to the moment the trap closes, and we describe the shape of the iron. This channel is funded by viewers, not by universities or corporations, and that independence is what lets us tell these stories without flinching. If this work matters to you, I want to invite you into our inner circle, the lineage. By joining the channel membership, you become more than a viewer. You become a patron of these investigations. Part of a community that understands history is a long warning written in human bone. Your support keeps the research deep and the storytelling honest. If you are one of us, click the join button and take your seat in the lineage. The Roman fleet anchored at Utica, a Phoenician sister city 40 kilometers up the coast that had already opened its gates to Rome without a fight. The consuls established their headquarters in the old citadel. From the walls of Carthage, when the wind blew right, the people could see the smoke of Roman cooking fires rising along the coastline. At night, the glow of camp torches stretched across the horizon like a second sunset that refused to set. Inside the city, the people waited. The streets around the Byrsa filled with refugees from the inland farms. The harbor stopped receiving foreign ships. The dye works went quiet. The smell of murex faded from the air for the first time in centuries. They had given up their army. They had given up their right to make war. They had given up their sovereignty in the most absolute legal form their world recognized. They stood in their open doorways and waited for the new terms of life that Rome had promised would be merciful. The first message arrived from the consuls within days. A herald rode down from Utica under a white flag. The demand he carried was simple. It seemed almost reasonable. The The Carthaginians, listening to it read aloud in the council chamber, even allowed themselves a moment of cautious relief. The second demand, when it came, would tell them what had really been agreed to in that warm Senate chamber. The Roman consuls did not walk to the gates of Carthage. They made Carthage walk to them. From their camp at Utica, where the wind off the bay carried the scent of pine resin from freshly cut siege timbers and the tar of caulked hulls, they sent a herald summoning the city's leadership. 30 senior magistrates of the council made the journey on foot, their robes white in the African sun, their sandals coated with the red dust of the coast road that ran past the salt pans of the Bagradas estuary. They were brought before a high wooden tribunal raised on freshly cut beams of Atlas cedar. Manius Manilius sat to the right, a stocky novus homo from Capua whose family had risen through legal practice rather than war. Lucius Marcius Censorinus sat to the left, a patrician of the gens Marcia who traced his ancestry to the legendary king Ancus Marcius. Behind them, in motionless ranks that ran back into the heat haze, stood 80,000 soldiers organized into 4 legions and a wing of allied infantry from the Italian Socii. The eagle standards caught the morning light. The lictors held their bundled rods upright with the axe heads protruding. No one spoke until Censorinus rose. Appian, who reconstructed the meeting from older Greek sources now lost, including the lost books of Polybius and the eyewitness memoirs of the Greek mercenary Sosilus's nephew, recorded that Censorinus began with a long preface on Roman magnanimity. He spoke in formal senatorial Latin, which a Punic interpreter rendered into the Phoenician dialect of the elders. He thanked the envoys for their wisdom. He reminded them that under the terms of deditio infidem, every soul in Carthage now belonged in legal fact to the Senate and people of Rome. Then he delivered the first demand: 300 children, sons and daughters of the leading houses, drawn specifically from the families that sat on the Council of 104, the supreme judicial body of the Carthaginian state. They were to be delivered to the Roman camp within 30 days. No substitutions, no exemptions. The names had already been written in Rome by clerks who had spent decades collating intelligence from Italian merchants trading in the Carthaginian markets. The envoys were given no time to consult their council. The clerks were already preparing the manifests. The news struck Carthage like a stone dropped into still water. The ripples moved outward through every aristocratic quarter on the Byrsa hill, down through the tradesmen's districts of Megara, into the fishermen's quarter that lay along the inner harbor. The choice of children was not random. By demanding the sons and daughters of the council, Rome was reaching into the marrow of the city's political class and squeezing. A senator whose 10-year-old son is sleeping on the floor of a Roman tent does not make speeches about resistance. The 30 days that followed were quiet in a way that frightened people. The markets stayed open, but the voices stayed low. Mothers stopped sending their children to play in the streets that ran below the temple of Eshmun. The temples of Tanit, the goddess to whom Carthaginian mothers had brought their prayers for generations, filled with women who came at dawn and stayed until the lamps were lit and went home without speaking. Outside the precinct, in the open-air sanctuary, the Romans would later call the Tophet. The stelae of older child sacrifices stood in their rows. Some of the older women, the historian Diodorus records, went there and pressed their foreheads against the stone as if asking the ancestors to take this cup from them. On the appointed day, the procession formed at the commercial harbor. Appian's account of that morning is one of the most painful scenes preserved from antiquity. The children, dressed in their best linen tunics dyed with the same Tyrian purple that had made the city rich, were assembled on the stone quay. Some were so young they did not understand and kept reaching back for their nurses. Older children stood silent, with the rigid composure of people who had been instructed not to weep in front of foreigners. A girl of perhaps 12, the daughter of a magistrate named Bostar, held the hand of her younger brother and recited the names of their grandparents aloud, over and over, so that he would not forget them. The mothers broke first. The wailing started near the back of the crowd and rolled forward like a wave hitting a breakwater. Women threw themselves on the gangplanks. They clutched the legs of Roman marines and would not be pried loose. They tried to climb into the triremes after their sons. The legionaries used their spear shafts to push them back, but first into the crowd. One woman, Appian writes, threw herself into the harbor and swam after the ship until she could no longer be seen from the dock. Another tore her infant from her own breast and held him up to the departing sail, screaming a name that the Roman scribes did not bother to record. Fathers stood in groups along the seawall. They did not run. They did not shout. They watched. They watched until the sails were small enough to be mistaken for gulls. Then they turned and walked back into the city in silence. Several of them, according to a fragment preserved by the later Christian historian Orosius, walked directly to their household altars and broke them. Carthage had paid. Carthage believed the payment would be enough. It was the down payment. With the hostages aboard ships bound for Lilybaeum in western Sicily, where they would be distributed among various Roman colonial households as wards of the Republic, the consuls moved their camp. They marched the army across the isthmus that connected Carthage to the African mainland and pitched their tents on the narrow neck of land between the Lake of Tunis and the open sea. The position was strategic to the inch. From it, no caravan could enter Carthage, and no farmer could leave it. The city was now a sealed jar. The magistrates were summoned again. The journey to the tribunal this time was shorter and somehow worse. The road passed through ground that had been Carthaginian farmland 6 weeks earlier and was now a Roman parade ground. The wheat trampled flat, the olive trees cut for firewood. Censorinus did not bother with the preface about Roman generosity. He came directly to the second demand. Since Carthage was now under the protective umbrella of Rome, she would have no further need for instruments of war. Every blade, every shaft, every helmet, every breastplate, every shield, every torsion spring, every coil of naval rope, every spare oar, every catapult, every bolt thrower, every set of horse barding, every ceremonial weapon hanging in every temple, every dagger worn at every belt, was to be carried out of the city and delivered to the Roman camp. The delegation did not respond. There was nothing to respond with. Their children were in Sicily. The army at their gates outnumbered every fighting-age man in the city by a margin so wide it could not be calculated as a battle. The gates opened. The procession that came out of Carthage over the next several days was the largest disarmament in the recorded history of the ancient world. Polybius's continuator and Appian both preserve the inventory. 200,000 panoplies of armor, 2,000 catapults of various calibers, including the heavy 3-talent stone throwers, built by the Greek engineer Demetrios of Syracuse a generation earlier. An uncountable mass of swords, javelins, spears, arrows, slings, and personal daggers. Bronze rams from the warships that had been mothballed in the inner harbor for half a century. Sailcloth and tarred rigging by the wagon load, even the ornamental weapons from the tomb of Hamilcar Barca, Hannibal's father, were brought out under guard and handed over. Roman quartermasters stood in the sun under linen awnings and tallied the loads as they arrived. The piles grew into hills. Hills grew into small ranges. Scribes ran out of wax tablets and had to send back to Utica for more. A junior officer named Gaius Laelius, son of Scipio Africanus's old friend of the same name, was placed in charge of cataloging the bronze, and his fingers grew so stained from handling the verdigris on the older shields that they were green for a week. The smiths of Carthage walked behind their own forges as the tools of their craft were carried away. The temple priests of Resheph, god of war, watched the votive offerings of generations of victorious admirals leave through the gates on ox carts. By the end of the surrender, the city contained no metal that could cut, no machine that could hurl, and no rope that could tension. The envoys returned to the council and reported that the demand had been fulfilled. The council voted to send the elders themselves, the full body, to receive whatever final terms Rome had prepared. They believed, with the desperate logic of people running out of ground, that the harshness must be ending. They had given Rome everything Rome had asked for. There was nothing left in the inventory to give. The full council walked out of the city in the third week after the disarmament. They were old men. Many of them used staffs of cedar carved with the symbol of Tanit. The road to the Roman tribunal had been worn smooth by their previous journeys. They were brought before Censorinus and made to stand. He kept them standing in the heat for over an hour. A few of the oldest were given small camp stools by a Roman tribune named Publius Cornelius Scipio Aemilianus, an act of courtesy that would later be remembered by both sides. When Censorinus finally spoke, he praised them. He praised their cooperation. He praised their wisdom. He told them they had behaved as a defeated people should behave. Then, without raising his voice, he read out the Senatus Consultum that had been written in Rome before any of these embassies had ever sailed, sealed with the wax of the Republic, and carried in a locked cedar box that lay open beside him on the tribunal. The city of Carthage was to be destroyed. The buildings were to come down. The walls were to be leveled. The harbors were to be filled in with rubble. The people would be permitted to live. They would be permitted to retain their laws and their gods. They would be relocated to a new settlement at a distance of no less than 10 Roman miles from the coast. The elders did not understand at first. The words arrived, but the meaning lagged behind them. The Punic interpreter, an elderly freedman named Hannibal Gisco, who had served Roman embassies for 30 years, paused and asked Censorinus to repeat the sentence. He repeated it more slowly. A city 10 miles from the sea. To Carthaginians, this was not relocation. It was extinction phrased as zoning policy. Every coin in the treasury, every word in the language, every prayer in the temples, every story told to children at bedtime had been shaped by the relationship between this people and the salt water at their feet. Their ancestors had crossed the Mediterranean from Tyre 8 centuries earlier, in 814 BC, according to the Carthaginian calendar, fleeing the political ambitions of a Phoenician princess named Elisa, whom the Romans would later call Dido. The sea was not their property. They were the sea's property. To take them inland was to convert a civilization into a refugee camp. The promise to spare the people of Carthage had been a legal trick. There would be no Carthaginians 10 miles from the coast. There would only be displaced persons with nowhere to go and no economic basis for survival. Appian records what happened next, and he does not soften it. One of the elders began to scream. It was not a sentence. It was a sound from below language, the noise a body makes when the mind in it has been broken. Others fell. Some tore the front of their robes open and began to claw at their own chests. A Phoenician mourning gesture older than the city itself. A few simply stood, eyes open, no longer present. The Roman officers watched without expression. They had been told what to expect. The young tribune Scipio Aemilianus reportedly turned his face away. His Greek tutor Polybius, who was traveling with him as both companion and advisor, would later write that this was the moment Scipio understood the trajectory of his own life. The survivors made the walk back to Carthage in a state of grief that no longer fit inside language. Word ran ahead of them through the gates. By the time they reached the city, the crowd was waiting at the inner forum below the Byrsa. The grief flipped into something else within the hour. The people understood, finally, what each step of the surrender had been. The hostages, the weapons, the reassurances. Every concession had been a piece of architecture in a building designed to fall on their heads. The deception had been planned in Rome years before, perhaps even before Cato's fig was passed around the Curia. They turned first on the men they could reach. The magistrates who had argued for accommodation were dragged from their houses. The mob found them in their atriums, in their courtyards, hiding in cisterns and under bedding. They were stoned in the streets. Some were torn apart with bare hands. The elder Gisgon, who had led the original peace embassy to Rome, was beaten to death on the steps of the Temple of Apollo, the same steps he had climbed an hour earlier to give thanks for what he believed had been a successful negotiation. The Roman messengers, who had accompanied the elders into the city, were nearly killed in the street, and were saved only when a small group of priests of Eschmoun pulled them into a temple and barred the bronze door. The gates of Carthage closed. The bars dropped into their iron brackets with a sound that several Roman sentries on the Utica Road claimed to have heard from miles away. The murmur of a port city was replaced by something new. The historian Florus, writing 2 centuries later from Roman archives, called it the voice of a population realizing it was already dead and deciding, anyway, to fight. A new general was elected from inside the walls. Hasdrubal, the same man who had been condemned to death months earlier for raising the army that fought Massinissa, was recalled from his hiding place in the countryside where he had been gathering a private force of around 20,000 men. He arrived at the gates with his troops and was admitted as commander-in-chief. A second Hasdrubal, called the Boiotharch, was appointed to command the city militia. The condemned man was now the only hope of the city that had condemned him. What happened in Carthage over the next months has no real parallel in ancient military history. The Romans had expected to occupy an empty husk. They found themselves besieging a city that had no weapons and was building them at a rate the Roman quartermasters could not account for. Every house became a forge. The historian Strabo, drawing on earlier accounts now lost, recorded the daily production rates that the Carthaginian government later published as a memorial: 100 shields per day, 300 swords per day, 1,000 javelins per day, 500 catapult bolts per day. Statues were pulled from atriums and melted. The bronze statue of Apollo from the city's main temple, 6 cubits tall and covered in gold leaf, was taken down by its own priests and broken up for arrow tips after the gold leaf had been peeled off and stored in the treasury. Door hinges, window grates, kitchen implements, decorative bronze from the public baths, the bronze sheathing from the speaker's platform in the council chamber, all of it went into improvised crucibles set up in courtyards and small public squares. The smoke from these crucibles changed the air over the city. Roman sentries on the inner siege line reported that Carthage smelled of hot metal day and night. The temples surrendered their votive offerings a second time, this time to be cast into sword blades and spear points. A priestess of Tanit named Sophonisba, named for the famous queen who had taken poison rather than be paraded through Rome a century earlier, personally supervised the melting of the goddess's silver crown. The catapults were the harder problem. Torsion artillery required springs of twisted sinew or hair, materials of high tensile strength that the city did not possess in quantity after the earlier disarmament. The decision was made in the council and announced in the streets. The women of Carthage were asked to give their hair. They gave it. From the wives of senators, to the women who scrubbed the floors of the temples, to the slaves working in the dye houses, they sat in the public squares and let their hair be cut to the scalp with bronze shears that had been forged the previous week from melted candlesticks. Appian, Florus, Strabo, and later the church father Orosius all preserved this detail because it shocked even Roman writers. The hair was braided into thick ropes by working teams that did not stop through the night. The smell of the braiding sheds, women sweating, the oil they rubbed on their hands to keep the strands smooth, scalp, lamp soot, was reportedly noticeable from 100 paces outside the buildings. The torsion springs made from this hair tested at a tensile strength higher than the sinew springs the Romans were using. In the inner harbor, the Kothon, shielded from Roman observation by its outer breakwater and a screen of canvas hung between masts, shipwrights began rebuilding a navy from scavenged timber. They took beams from old warehouses. They stripped the cedar roofs from civic buildings, including the roof of the main grain exchange. They cut a new channel that did not appear on any chart, opening at a point of the coast the Romans were not watching. The work done at night by men hauling baskets of earth on their backs and dumping it into the bay. For you, the history reader, this period of the siege is one of the richest in the ancient record, and most of the granular detail comes from a small group of surviving sources that classical scholars have spent 2,000 years reconstructing. The primary text we drew from for this section is now available to you directly. Click the View Products button on your screen. The book opens up the full archaeological and textual record of the siege, including the recent excavations at the Kothon site that have confirmed the existence of the secret channel exactly where Appian said it was. While you are in the shop shelf, you will also find a curated collection of themed relics and dark memorabilia inspired by the fall of Carthage. We will not spoil what is in there. Take a moment to look while the story continues. The first 2 years of the siege were a slow disaster for Rome. Manilius and Censorinus were competent administrators and indifferent generals. Their assaults on the triple wall of Carthage, a fortification system that included 30-meter towers and stalls for 300 war elephants built directly into the masonry, were beaten back by defenders who should not have had weapons. The Roman siege camps along the Lake of Tunis were swept by dysentery from the brackish marshes, an outbreak so severe that the field hospital at Utica overflowed, and the dying had to be laid in rows under awnings on the beach. Carthaginian sortie parties came out at night through small gates and burned the siege towers as fast as the Romans could build them. The cavalry commander Himilco Famius, a noble of the Barcid faction who had served in Numidian armies before the war, raided the Roman supply lines so successfully that grain prices in the legion camps doubled in a single season, and a Roman quaestor was lynched by his own soldiers after being accused of speculation. The Mediterranean watched in disbelief. A disarmed city had stalled the Republic. Diplomatic dispatches from the court of Attalus II Saturdu at Pergamon, the court of Ptolemy VI in Alexandria, and the council chambers of free Greek cities like Rhodes began to speculate about Roman decline. A letter from a Rhodian magistrate to the Carthaginian council, intercepted by Roman intelligence and preserved in fragmentary form, offered congratulations and a discreet loan. Then, on a morning in the late summer of 148 BC that should have ended the war, a Roman battering ram operated by a centurion named Lucius Hostilius Mancinus broke through a section of the outer harbor wall. The legions poured into the breach, expecting collapse. They found 50 newly built warships, oars manned, rams bronze-tipped, hulls still smelling of fresh pine pitch, sailing out of a channel the Romans had not known existed. The ghost fleet of Carthage struck the Roman blockading squadron from behind and scattered it across the Bay of Tunis. 3 Roman quinqueremes were rammed and sunk, The flagship lost its rudder and ran aground at the foot of the Megara walls, where the crew was taken prisoner. The shock in the consular tent that evening was beyond military. It was metaphysical. They were not besieging a city. They were besieging a will. In Rome, patience ran out. The Senate convened an extraordinary session in the Temple of Bellona on the Campus Martius, the chamber reserved for war business with foreign powers. The recall of the consuls was debated. New names were put forward. One name kept returning to the floor, suggested by Cato's old allies and supported now by Scipio Nasica Corculum, who had opposed the war from the beginning and now wanted it finished before Rome's reputation collapsed further. The name belonged to a junior officer who had served in Africa already, who had watched the disaster at Oroscopa from inside Massinisa's camp 4 years earlier, who had handed camp stools to the elders on the day the death sentence was read, who spoke Punic, who knew the ground, and who knew the families inside the walls by name. He was 36 years old. He had not yet held the consulship. He was not legally eligible. The Senate would have to pass a special exemption to elect him. They passed it the same afternoon. He carried a name that Carthaginian mothers had been using for 3 generations to frighten children into silence. His birth father was Lucius Aemilius Paulus, the victor of Pydna. His adoptive grandfather was the man who had stood on the field of Zama in 202 BC and dictated the treaty that began this entire chain of events. Publius Cornelius Scipio Aemilianus Africanus. His ship was being prepared at Ostia. The wind that would carry him to Africa was already rising in the west. In the spring of 147 BC, the man Rome had been waiting for stepped off a transport at the harbor of Utica. Publius Cornelius Scipio Aemilianus was 36 years old. He carried a name that had been engineered for this moment by 2 great families. His birth father, Lucius Aemilius Paulus Macedonicus, had crushed the Antigonid dynasty at Pydna in 168 BC, ending 3 centuries of Macedonian power in a single afternoon. His adoptive grandfather, Publius Cornelius Scipio Africanus, had stood over a defeated Hannibal at Zama in 202 BC and dictated the treaty that began the long suffocation of Carthage. This was not a military appointment, it was a closing ceremony. The Senate had broken its own laws to give him the command. He was below the legal age for the consulship by 6 years under the Lex Vilia Annalis. He had applied for the lower office of aedile. The popular assembly, prompted by Cato's old allies and by Scipio Nasica Corculum, voted instead to make him consul by acclamation. The Senate ratified the result in a single afternoon at the Temple of Bellona. The old generation needed to see the circle closed before they died, and they did not trust the work to anyone else. His traveling household reflected the gravity of the assignment. With him sailed Polybius of Megalopolis, the Greek historian who had been his tutor since the year his adoptive father brought him into the Scipionic family at age 18. With him also came the philosopher Panaetius of Rhodes, a Stoic who would later shape the moral thinking of an entire Roman generation. He brought his younger brother, Quintus Fabius Maximus Aemilianus, as a senior officer, and a quaestor named Gaius Laelius the Younger, son of his adoptive father's closest friend. His first act on arrival was to walk the Roman lines and read them. He did not speak much. Polybius recorded that Scipio dismissed 3 legionary tribunes for incompetence within his first week. He hanged a quartermaster who had been selling siege provisions to Carthaginian smugglers operating out of small coves north of Cape Bon. He executed a centurion of the 7th cohort of the 3rd Legion for sleeping at his post during the 2nd watch. He expelled the camp followers, the prostitutes, the wine sellers, the fortune tellers, every non-combatant who had attached itself to the army during the long stagnation under Manilius. The slack discipline of the previous 2 years tightened in 7 days. His next act was personal. He rode out with a small escort to the Numidian camp at Cirta to pay respects to the descendants of Massinissa. The old king had died in 148 BC, 90 years old, still riding bareback in his final spring. Scipio had been named in his will as the executor of the kingdom's division among his sons. He confirmed the partition on a wax tablet sealed with his consular ring and returned to Utica the same week. The diplomatic act secured his rear flank and the supply of Numidian cavalry he would need for what came next. Then he began the engineering work that would suffocate the city. He built a mole, a wall of dressed stone, 96 Roman feet wide at the base, driven straight across the mouth of the commercial harbor. Appian preserved the dimensions because they shocked his readers. The construction crews worked in shifts day and night under torchlight, dumping quarried stone from the limestone cliffs at Cape Farina, packing rubble in baskets carried by mule teams, fitting blocks cut by Greek masons from Sicily who had been hired specifically for the project. The mole sealed the Kothon from the open sea. No more ghost fleets, no more smugglers, no more grain from sympathetic merchants running the blockade from Rhodes or the Greek colonies of southern Gaul. Inside the city, the Carthaginians did the impossible one more time. They dug another channel by hand. The work was done at night by teams of citizens and freed slaves carrying baskets of earth up from the shore. They opened a new outlet on the opposite side of the harbor and launched a small fleet of 50 hastily rebuilt vessels under a young admiral whose name Appian gives as Hannibal, a relative of the great commander but 2 generations removed. They sailed out at dawn into a sea Scipio had already mapped. His warships were waiting in a half-moon formation. The Carthaginian flotilla was burned in shallow water within sight of its own walls. Hannibal the admiral was killed by an arrow to the throat during the first hour of the engagement. The smoke from the burning hulls drifted back over the city like a verdict. Winter came down on Carthage in 147 BC. The famine arrived with it. The harbor mole had cut off everything. Grain prices inside the walls climbed past the point where money meant anything. Appian records that horses were eaten first, then dogs. Then leather harnesses boiled until the tannin leached out. Then the bodies of the dead, taken in secret at first from the public graves below the Temple of Apollo, and then openly as the taboo collapsed under the weight of starvation. Mothers stopped lactating. Children stopped crying because they no longer had the strength. The temples of Tanit, once kept by attendants who washed the marble floors twice a day, accumulated layers of human ash from the small cremations families performed inside chapels because they could no longer carry their dead to the proper burial grounds outside the walls. The smell of the city changed, and the Roman sentries on the inner siege line reported that the air over Carthage had taken on the sweet stench of a slaughterhouse left too long in summer. Hasdrubal, the commander of the defense, made his headquarters in the temple of Eshmun on the highest point of the Byrsa. He dressed in the purple cloak of a Carthaginian shofet, the chief magistrate. He ate roast meat at banquets, while his soldiers chewed on belt straps and boiled the hilts of their swords for the dried glue. He executed Roman prisoners on the walls in full view of the besiegers, having them thrown alive from the parapet onto the rocks below, and on at least one occasion, according to Polybius, he had the captives tortured, first by having their eyes put out with bronze spikes heated in a brazier. Polybius wrote that Hasdrubal had stopped being a general and become a symptom of his city's collapse. The Roman officers watching from the siege line came to despise him so completely that they began to look forward to the moment of his capture less as a military objective than as a personal satisfaction. The final assault came in the early spring of 146 BC. Scipio chose the harbor wall as the breaching point, the same section where the Ghost Fleet had once sailed out. The Roman engineer corps under the Praefectus Fabrum Sextus Julius Caesar, a distant ancestor of the dictator who would be born 66 years later, had spent 3 months identifying the weakest courses of masonry. The breach opened on a morning in late March. The smell of the sea mixed with the dust of pulverized limestone. The legions poured through. What happened next was not a battle in any sense the word usually carries. It was a sentence being executed. Scipio issued an order to his centurions that was passed down the ranks in clipped formal Latin. Spare no one, take no prisoners, clear the streets. The Roman war machine had been built over 4 centuries for exactly this kind of work, and now it performed at the full extent of its design specification. The legionaries moved in disciplined groups of 20, organized by neighborhood according to maps that had been drawn from intelligence gathered before the siege began. They kicked doors. They went through houses, room by room. Old men were killed in their beds. Women were killed at their hearths. Children were killed in courtyards where they had been hiding behind cisterns and grain jars that no longer held grain. Pregnant women were killed where they stood, and the bodies were not opened for any further purpose because there was no time. Appian, drawing on the eyewitness accounts of Polybius, describes the work in language that survived every later editor who tried to soften it. The narrow streets of the lower city, where the tenement blocks rose 6 stories above paved alleys 8 feet wide, became impassable within hours. Bodies and wounded clogged the routes the legions needed to advance through. Scipio ordered the houses cleared from above. Roman soldiers climbed to the upper floors of the apartment blocks and threw the inhabitants out the windows. The dead, the wounded, the still living. They fell into the streets below until the legionaries marching behind walked on a surface of human flesh rather than stone. Appian records that the iron-shod sandals of the advancing infantry made a wet sound that was distinct from the sound of marching on paving stones, a sound the soldiers themselves never forgot. The injured were finished with sword thrusts as the columns passed over them. For 6 days and 6 nights, the killing continued. The sound of the city in those days, according to a letter from a tribune named Quintus Fabius Maximus that survives in fragmentary form in a later anthology, was a single continuous noise that did not pause for darkness. Screams, the collapse of burning roofs, the clash of metal in confined spaces, the crying of animals that had not yet been eaten, the hiss of human fat hitting open flame. Scipio rotated his legions in 12-hour shifts. Fresh soldiers replaced exhausted ones at the front of the advance. He himself, according to Polybius, did not sleep more than 2 hours at a stretch through the entire 6 days. He walked the lines at night with a torch and an escort, checking the discipline of his men, ensuring that the killing remained methodical rather than recreational. He hanged 2 legionaries on the 3rd night for raping a Carthaginian woman before killing her. The order had been to kill, not to enjoy. The advance moved from the harbor inward, up the slope of the Byrsa hill, toward the citadel and the temple of Eschmoun, where Hasdrubal had withdrawn with the last defenders. Every street was contested. Every house had to be taken. The fighting was so close that Roman swords were often too long to use in the narrow stairwells of the tenements, and legionaries finished men with daggers and the iron-shod butts of their pila. Some of the defenders fought with weapons forged from kitchen iron that very week. By the 5th day, fires that had been set in dozens of separate buildings began to merge. The Carthaginian quarter of artisans, where the dye-works had once made the city rich, burned in a single sheet of flame 15 meters high. The cedar roofs of the public buildings on the Byrsa caught one after another, releasing the stored resin of timber that had been imported from the cedar groves of Lebanon 4 centuries earlier. The smoke column was visible from Utica, 40 kilometers away. The Numidian cavalry waiting in reserve on the high ground south of the Lake of Tunis reported that the column rose so high that day it deflected the wind. On the 7th day, a delegation came down from the citadel under olive branches. Their spokesman was an aristocrat named Bithyas, a member of the Carthaginian council who had survived the original purge of the peace party. They asked Scipio for the lives of those who remained. Scipio granted it, on terms. 50,000 survivors filed out of the upper city, the entire surviving population of what had been the 3rd largest city in the Mediterranean basin, after Alexandria and Antioch. They were skeletons. Their clothes hung on them in strips. Many could not walk, and were carried by relatives who were themselves half dead. They were sorted on the slope below the Byrsa by Roman officers with wax tablets. They were entered as property of the Roman state, assigned identification marks burned into their forearms with hot iron, and sold into slavery within the week through dealers based in Utica and across the strait in Sicily. But one group refused the terms. 900 Roman deserters who had joined the Carthaginian defense knew there would be no mercy for them under Roman military law. The penalty for desertion to the enemy was crucifixion at minimum, and for those who had taken arms against their former comrades, the additional punishment of having the hands cut off before execution. They withdrew with Hasdrubal, his wife, and his 2 young sons into the temple of Eshmun, the holiest site in the city, built on the highest point of the Byrsa, and reached by a staircase of 60 marble steps. They barricaded the bronze doors, which had been cast in the time of Hannibal's grandfather. They made their last stand on consecrated ground. Scipio surrounded the temple. He did not assault it. He set it on fire. The cedar beams that supported the upper galleries caught quickly. The temple had been built 6 centuries earlier from timber imported from the slopes of Mount Lebanon and treated with pine pitch to resist sea air. It burned with the heat of a forge. The bronze fittings began to melt within the first hour. The marble of the inner sanctum cracked from the heat, and the cracking sounded, to the Roman soldiers below, like the snapping of bones. Hasdrubal's nerve broke. The man who had executed Roman prisoners on his own walls, who had eaten roast lamb while his soldiers boiled leather, who had worn purple while the city died around him, opened a small side door at the back of the burning temple and ran out alone. He carried an olive branch in one hand. He had stripped off his purple cloak. He threw himself at Scipio's feet in the courtyard below the steps. He clutched at the Roman general's ankles. He begged for his life in fluent Latin, a language he had learned as a young man during a diplomatic visit to Rome in his 20s. Scipio granted it. He had Hasdrubal sat down on a piece of broken column drum and forced to watch what came next. On the roof of the burning temple, his wife appeared. Her name has not survived. Appian does not give it. Polybius does not give it. The Roman tradition recorded the act and erased the name, perhaps deliberately. She was dressed in her best ceremonial robe, the white linen embroidered with gold thread that Carthaginian noblewomen wore at the festival of Tanit. Her 2 young sons stood beside her, one on each side, holding her hands. The older boy was perhaps 9. The younger was perhaps 6. She looked down past the Roman lines and found her husband sitting on the broken column drum. Her voice, according to the eyewitness account Polybius would later relay to his Greek readers in Book 38 of his Histories, carried over the noise of the fire because the wind had shifted and the column of smoke was moving the other way. She did not address Scipio. She did not address the legionaries assembled in the courtyard below. She addressed her husband alone, in Punic. which a Roman officer of Phoenician extraction translated for Scipio in real time. She called him a traitor. She called him a coward, unworthy of the city he had been sworn to defend. She told him that the Romans, who were burning her family alive, had done nothing wrong by the standards of war, as both their peoples had practiced it for 1,000 years. They had taken what war allowed them to take. The shame, she said, belonged only to the Carthaginian who had crawled out of a burning temple to save his own skin, while his wife and children remained inside it. Then she stopped speaking to him. She turned to the Roman officers below and gave them a formal farewell in the Punic style, the same words a guest would say to a host at the end of a meal. She thanked them, with a small bow, for their efficiency. She told them she would now make a funeral monument of herself and her sons. She took her older boy by one hand, she took her younger boy by the other. She walked them to the edge of the roof. She did not pause. She stepped forward into the fire, taking her children with her into the flames. Polybius wrote that the Roman soldiers in the courtyard, men who had been killing for 6 days without rest, were silent for the first time in a week. The 900 Roman deserters inside fought until the roof beams gave way, and the upper galleries collapsed into the burning sanctuary below. They were buried in the rubble. Their bones are still there. French archaeologists working at the Byrsa site in the 1970s, under the direction of Serge Lancel, recovered scorched human remains from the layer of ash that marks the temple's collapse, mixed with melted bronze fittings from Roman military equipment. The siege was over. Carthage had fallen on a date that the Roman calendar later recorded as falling sometime in the month corresponding to early April of 146 BC. But Scipio's work was not done. For 10 days after the killing stopped, the Roman army became a demolition corps. The legions were divided into work parties of 200 men each. They pulled down what fire had not consumed. The triple walls, 13 meters high and reinforced with elephant stalls, built directly into the masonry on the lower level, were dismantled stone by stone using leverage poles and rope teams. The temples were toppled by undermining their foundations and pulling them sideways with cables. The harbor, the engineering masterpiece that had defined the city for 4 centuries, was filled with rubble from the demolished walls until the basin was solid ground that could be walked across. The Roman Senate had sent a commission of 10 senators to oversee the destruction in person. Their leader was a senator named Lucius Mummius, who would later be remembered for destroying Corinth in the same year by senatorial decree. The commissioners walked the ruins with Scipio. They certified, item by item against a written checklist, that the city was being erased to the standard the Senatus Consultum had required. They pronounced the formal religious curse, a Roman ritual called the devotio, in which the ground itself was dedicated to the gods of the underworld and forbidden to human use under penalty of sacrilege. The story passed down through later tradition, repeated most famously in the Cambridge Ancient History by Bertrand Hallward and popularized in the 20th century through Arnold Toynbee, was that the Romans then sowed the broken ground with salt to ensure that nothing would grow there again. Modern archaeology has found no chemical evidence of salting in the soil layers excavated at the site. The legend appears to be a medieval addition, but the intention it describes was real. The site was forbidden ground for 24 years until Gaius Gracchus tried to plant a Roman colony there in 122 BC, and the experiment was abandoned after political opposition in Rome cited the curse. The intellectual erasure was more methodical than the physical one. Carthage had possessed a library. 8 centuries of Phoenician and Punic writing had been collected there. History, philosophy, poetry, religious texts, navigation manuals from voyages along the African Atlantic coast that no Greek or Roman had ever made. The library was looted by the senatorial commission and divided among the friendly Numidian kings as a diplomatic gesture. Pliny the Elder, writing in his natural history 2 centuries later, recorded that the bulk of the books was given to the heirs of Massinissa and disappeared into private royal archives that have never been recovered. One work was kept, a 28-volume treatise on agriculture written by a Carthaginian author named Mago, a practical handbook on farming, soil chemistry, livestock breeding, and viticulture. The Roman Senate ordered it translated into Latin by a commission led by a senator named Decimus Junius Silanus, a man who had learned Punic for the purpose. The translation entered the Roman agricultural tradition through the works of Varro and Columella, and shaped Italian farming for the next 4 centuries. Everything else was destroyed or scattered. The Carthaginian voice was deliberately silenced. From 146 BC forward, the history of Carthage would be written exclusively by the people who had destroyed her. There is no surviving Punic account of the fall. Every word we have about the siege, the betrayals, the women cutting their hair, the wife on the temple roof, comes from Greek and Roman pens. It was Polybius, standing beside Scipio on a hilltop overlooking the smoking ruins on the 11th day after the breach, who recorded the moment that would haunt classical literature for 2,000 years. Scipio Aemilianus was weeping. The conqueror, the man who had ordered the burning of one of the great cities of the ancient world, stood looking at his own victory and could not speak. The wind from the sea carried the smell of burning cedar across the hill where he stood. Polybius, who had known him since boyhood, asked him gently what was wrong. Scipio answered in Greek. He quoted the Iliad, the lines spoken by the Trojan hero Hector in Book 6 of the poem, foreseeing the fall of his own city, while his wife Andromache wept beside him. A day will come when sacred Troy shall perish, and Priam and his people with him. Then Scipio turned to his old tutor and said, more quietly, that he was afraid the same words would one day be spoken over Rome. Polybius preserved the exact phrase in his 38th book. The historian Diodorus Siculus quoted it again 2 generations later. Appian quoted it a 3rd time. The line outlived the empire that produced it. Polybius wrote that he understood at that moment what kind of man stood beside him. Not a tyrant, not a fanatic, a man who had been given a task by his ancestors and had completed it with full attention, and who saw, in the smoke rising from the harbor below, the long arc of his own state's future. A republic that learns to solve problems by annihilation does not unlearn the lesson. The skill turns inward. Within 100 years of that morning on the hill above Carthage, Roman legions would march on Rome itself. Tiberius Gracchus would be beaten to death with the leg of a bench in the Forum in 133 BC, only 13 years later. Sulla would proscribe his enemies in 82 BC and post their heads on spikes in the same Forum. Caesar would cross the Rubicon in 49 BC. Antony would post the severed head and hands of Cicero on the rostra of the Senate House in 43 BC, in the very chamber where Cato had once passed a fig from hand to hand. The destruction of Carthage was not the high point of the Republic. It was the moment the Republic broke the seal on something inside itself that would, over the following century, eat it from within. The fig had finally been answered, and the answer had cost both cities their souls. Scipio Aemilianus himself would die in his bed in 129 BC, 17 years after the fall of Carthage, found dead one morning under circumstances his contemporaries believed to be assassination. The killer was never named. He had become inconvenient to too many factions in the new Rome, the Rome he had warned Polybius about on the hilltop. Carthage would lie in ruins for over a century. Julius Caesar founded a new Roman colony on the site in 49 BC. Augustus completed it. By the 2nd century AD, the new Carthage had become the second city of the Western Roman Empire. Augustine of Hippo studied rhetoric there in the 4th century. The ground that had been cursed produced bishops and grain and olive oil for the imperial fleet. But it was a Roman city. The people who had lived there before were dust under the new pavement. Thank you for staying with us all the way to the end of this story. Your time and your attention are what allow this channel to keep investigating the histories that polished textbooks have buried. If this video moved you, take one moment to subscribe to Ancestral, leave a like, and share the video with one person you know will sit through it. That single share is the most powerful thing you can do to help these stories reach the people who need them. You've just watched another premium documentary by Ancestral, your ultimate history hub on YouTube. Another video is now appearing on your screen. It has been chosen specifically to continue the journey you started here. Click it. Walk further into the darkness with us. The next story is already waiting.